Okay, today for lesson 2, we're going to talk about Christianity and why and how it spread. So first of all, as we've talked about before when we talked about the Roman Empire, when there's times of peace, people can move around the empire freely and safely. And so that happens during this time. Also, remember that the Romans built roads, and so it is easier to travel to various parts of the empire. So those reasons together are going to make trade and, of course, ideas like religion also spread. Also, throughout the empire, they had a common language, so you can communicate easily. And therefore, of course, share your ideas like your religion. There was Latin and then later also Greek throughout the eastern part. And also remember, Greek was also a language of learning that they shared. Okay, so those reasons make it pretty easy to share the message. Also, their message was something that people found attractive, found good. Remember that the Romans, when they told you to worship all the different gods and the emperor and all the idols, right? It doesn't really do anything for the people. It's all about the glory of the emperor. And so people who are suffering and starving are going to like the idea of Christianity, where they're saying, no, even if your life isn't good here, we're going to help you and you're going to get into heaven and have this great afterlife. So that's something kind of look forward to. Also, the people in the Christian faith tended to live together in communities, and remember how they were talking about how you should treat each other and be helpful of each other. So those ideas are going to seem really nice for people who are struggling. Okay. So why did the Romans not like the Christians? Well, first of all, they saw them as a threat. The Christians were resisting their trying to tell them they had to worship the emperor, right, and all the different gods. And the Christians would say no. In fact, they'd be pretty outspoken that was immoral, and they wouldn't participate with their festivals and do what they're told, right, which of course the Romans aren't going to like. Also, Christians did not believe in war. They thought that was not the way to solve your problems. So remember that the Romans had a requirement that you serve in the army and help out. And so having them refuse to be in the army is also showing a way that they are not cooperating. The other thing is, the book mentions it here real quickly. I bet you wondered why burying their dead would matter. Christians did not believe like the Romans. The Romans thought that the bodies should be cremated, and Christians believe very heavily that they needed to be preserved and buried, right? Because that's the idea of you're going to be reborn into heaven, right? So you kind of need your body kind of thing. So the Christians, there was a law in Rome that you couldn't bury within the city, and so they had to go outside the city and bury in catacombs, they're called. I have a video I'm going to show you about that. And so again, the Christians would go outside the city in big groups, and then they would seem to be organizing, right, and meeting secretly, even though they're really just having memorial services.
Explore an underground city of the dead, where members of a new religion, oppressed by the greatest empire on earth, were buried in hope of an eternal afterlife. A dead man may neither be burned nor buried within the walls of the city. Such was the decree of Roman law between the 2nd and 4th century A.D. This strict rule about how corpses were to be disposed of was imposed on all residents of Rome. Most Romans were pagan and preferred to be cremated. Their ashes were stored in small urns above ground. But the ancient Christians and Jews of Rome insisted on burial of their dead. Wealthy citizens had lined the roads just outside the city with family tombs. These tombs were called catacombas, which is Greek for "at the hollows." The name came from the natural hollow spaces that lined the Via Appia, one of the ancient roads that led to and from Rome. Into these hollow spaces, the first Christian cemetery was built above ground. It is from these early catacombas that the catacombs of Rome evolved. Most are now closed to the public in order to protect their wall paintings, which even human breath could damage beyond repair. Although this funerary art was probably created to entertain the dead, the paintings provide us with a rare window into the past. A look at daily life and early religious belief in Rome during the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. The construction of the catacombs began in the 2nd century. The move from ground level to underground burial sites was caused by the need for more space. Early Christians excavated a vast system of galleries and linking passages, one beneath the other, joined by narrow, steep steps that descend as far as 4 stories. These passages measure about 8 feet high and less than 3 feet wide. Slot-like graves called loculi, Latin for little place, were cut into the walls, just large enough to hold one body each. It was into these slots that the bodies of common workers, mothers, children, and elders were interred. The rich were often laid to rest in elaborate marble sarcophagi, the costliest form of burial. Saints and martyrs who had died for the faith were entombed in an acrosolium, a place of honor. It consists of a grave slot dug below a semicircular niche carved into the wall and decorated with symbolic painted figures. Many of the catacombs were named for the saints who were buried inside them. Those named for Saints Peter and Marcellinus contain paintings that provide clues about the men who dug these cities of the dead.
The catacombs were actually dug by a guild of professional diggers. They were called fossori, which means the cave makers. And they were like a trade union, a skilled craft, a very difficult one, of course.
The fossori labored in the bedrock below Rome that is made up of tufa, a soft mineral that resembles sandstone. They fashioned this tufa into elaborate galleries, rich with architectural detail carved right into the soft stone, creating the impression that the catacombs grew here by some miraculous natural force. The early tunnel diggers sought to safeguard the tombs from sacrilege and thievery. They designed these mazes and narrow passageways to make it difficult or impossible for an outsider to find his way in or out.
When you combine then the idea that the body must be preserved because in Christian dogma it will rise and be restored to its human state, then the preservation of the body underground in a place that's hard to get into, can be guarded and the like, makes good sense.
The passages were so dark and foreboding that the Latin scholar Saint Jerome wrote that a Sunday visit to the crypt of a martyr more resembled a visit to hell.
I was accustomed to visit, on Sundays, the sepulchres of the apostles and martyrs. And often did I enter the crypts, deep dug in the earth, with their walls on either side lined with the bodies of the dead, where everything is so dark that it almost seems as if the psalmist's words were fulfilled. Let them go down alive into hell.
Modern-day visitors still report a sensation not unlike what St. Jerome felt over 1,000 years ago.
The experience of entering a catacomb is really not like any other experience I can think of. They are very cold. The temperature drops 40, even 50 degrees. It's damp underground. Today there's just a faintly moldy smell to catacombs, nothing worse than that. But the most striking thing about catacombs is the absolute pitch blackness. And the archaeologist has a flashlight, a very powerful flashlight, but the minute he's out of sight, the minute he turns a corner, it's as if he's not there at all. And that is a very, very unnerving sensation.
Okay, so because they were thought to be such troublemakers, they're often blamed for any kind of problems. Nero, remember, we talked about him, loved to blame the problems on the Christians, even natural disasters and things that clearly weren't their fault, like they accused them of being responsible for the fire that burned most of Rome. He went so far as to outlaw Christianity and make it illegal, and they were arrested and beaten and told they had to give up their Bibles and say there was no such thing as the one true God. And so they were put under a lot of pressure, right? And so sometimes people would, if you did not give up your beliefs, you might become a martyr, because if you are willing to die rather than give up your beliefs, that's what a martyr is. So that did happen sometimes. And right, like some were put into the pits with the animals and things like that. So surprisingly, even with all that pressure, Christianity still grew, okay? And then it gets a little help a little later. So during the early parts of the 300s AD, they were getting persecuted, right? This is during Diocletian's time. But then they get a big boost with the Emperor Constantine. And there's an interesting story about Constantine, that he apparently had a dream the night before a battle, and in that dream he saw a flaming cross up in the sky, and underneath it was written the words, "In this sign you will conquer." So the next day he told his soldiers to go ahead and paint the Christian cross on their battle shields, and he ended up winning the battle. So he thought that he had been spoken to by the Christian God, and the God had helped him win, and therefore he was now a believer. So he started doing things like, there's a famous, he issued something called the Edict of Milan, which said that basically it let everyone have religious freedom. So it was including Christians, which is a big change, right? And so he himself would go and start attending meetings and building churches and things like that, okay? Then he even made some laws that helped Christians, like letting them get out of taxes, and they don't have to serve in the army, all the things that were like issues before with the Romans, right? And then one of the later emperors after him, Theodosius, is actually one of the ones who goes even further, and he now makes Christianity the official religion, and he bans the other ones, like the Greeks and the Romans that had multiple gods, and he says, no, this is the true official religion. And so clearly the religion's going to grow quite a bit once it's the official religion. Okay, your book takes a turn real quickly here and says, and also Christianity grew throughout Africa too, which is completely true, and they don't spend a lot of time on it. If you recall, we talked about the trade routes going throughout this region and also on the coast of Africa. Remember we talked back, I don't know if you remember, about that, and Axum, remember, was one of the major trade cities we talked about. So of course it makes sense that with this trade and everything, also the religion's going to spread quite a bit to Africa also. All right, and then I'm going to take a second, and this next section is all about the hierarchy of the church. The church looked to what it knew, right? And the Roman Empire had a lot of success with a lot of different, organization of who's in charge, or hierarchy is usually like a pyramid, right? And so I'm going to show you a little diagram that I sometimes used to help people understand. For some reason, kids have trouble with the wording. So I will stop here and show you a quick little graphic that I usually draw when I draw it in person. Okay, so this is a diagram I usually write on the board, so I'm going to try to insert it in here. So to explain some of the vocab and the hierarchy of the church system. So first of all, if you are Christian and you go to worship, you go to a church. So let's say this is your local church in your neighborhood, okay? And you would be down here, one of the people going to church, right? And there's your neighbor and the other people that are going to church with you. These people are all called the laity, okay? Those are people who are just the church members, people who go and worship. Now, of course, there's someone who is leading the worship called a priest. And actually, there's probably several priests in your church. And so I went ahead and put a little cross up on his head, right? That's the head person of the church. So here's the one church. Now, of course, there are other churches like in like the other side of town, there'll be another church, right? And depending on how big your area is, there could be multiple churches all over. So each one of those would, of course, have people who go there, the laity and the priests in charge, right? So then you need to have someone kind of in charge of all those churches, and that person is called the bishop. And so they are in charge of all of them. And then all of them together are collectively called a diocese, okay? And so there's several dioceses. It's usually around a major city and the surrounding area. So like I just name this one, like maybe the San Francisco diocese. And then you could say down here, there's the San Jose diocese. And of course, I didn't draw it all, but there would be all the churches right within there and all the people, the priests and everything. And then here's the Sacramento diocese over here. And so, of course, you need someone to kind of oversee all of those dioceses. And right, so those bishops. So then you have someone who controls everything, all of those, and that's called the archbishop. Okay, the archbishop is in charge of the bishops of each diocese. Okay, all right, and then in the book they mention at this time back in the early, 8300s or so, there are 5 major patriarchs. Okay, so 5 archbishops. Oh, that's awesome. So 5 archbishops. The 5 archbishops of the biggest areas are called the patriarchs. Okay, so there's 5 patriarchs. So what's confusing to some kids is that they will refer to someone as a bishop, and let's say they're the Bishop of Rome. Okay, well, the Bishop of Rome is the person who is in charge of all the areas, in Rome, but he is also maybe in charge of the whole area, and so he's an archbishop. So patriarchs are archbishops. They're just the more powerful archbishops, and then they usually just call them a bishop for short. So sometimes it's confusing to kids that they will say, someone's name and just call them a bishop, but that doesn't mean that they're not a very powerful bishop, okay? Okay, so now that you understand the hierarchy of the different people in the church, I do want to say that, so remember those 5 archbishops from the major cities were called the patriarchs. So there's 5 major areas were Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, okay? And so one of the things they were trying to do is get everyone throughout the empire to understand and teach the religion the same, okay? Because that was one of the issues they were having. And so they would have the bishops meet and decide what was the true beliefs of the church and how it should best be taught. So that's called the doctrine, the official teachings of the church. And if people were to say things against the official teachings, then that's called heresy. Okay, when you speak out and say things against what the church says is true. All right, now as far as the teachings using documents, there is the Christian Bible, and interestingly enough, Jesus did not write himself all about what he believed. Instead, what we have are what his followers, the apostles, right, remember about him, and they wrote down after him. So those four major accounts of his life by the four apostles, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, make up a lot of the what they call the New Testament. It was those four Gospels, those four written accounts of his life are called the Gospels. So the four Gospels plus some other major writings by some of the other leaders, like for instance, Paul, remember Saul, who was one of the major leaders at the time. So they put these all together into the New Testament. And then they add those to what they are originally Jewish, right? And so they have all those original beliefs, and they have those original writings, and they call those they call those the Old Testament, the Jewish faith. So they basically put the New Testament with the Old Testament, and that is now what we call the Christian Bible. Okay. Also, the book mentioned here, again, going back to Africa, that you couldn't really say about all the major leaders and important figures unless you talk about Augustine. He is one of the bishops from Northern Africa, and he wrote a book all about what, the views of the Christians at this time. It's a history book called The City of God. So he is a major figure in Christianity, so you can't forget him. That's who the picture right over here. All right, so then we're going to kind of skip ahead. So we had talked about like the 300s AD, and now we're going to talk around 600 AD. So this is where we start to see kind of a breaking down between the churches in the East and the West. In the West, the major archbishop, right, patriarch, was in Rome, and that bishop, so it's a bishop, he's also an archbishop because he's in charge of, right, the whole area, and then he's also a patriarch. It's okay to be multiple things. So the patriarch is like the head bishop, right? So he believes that he is all that. He thinks he should be in charge. He is, from one of the original churches in Rome that was, made by the Apostle Peter. And so he takes this title called Pope, and he starts saying like he was in charge of the whole thing. Now, of course, the people around him in the West agree, and the Western side becomes the Roman Catholic Church. And they're all Latin speaking, right, of course. The Eastern side becomes what we call the Eastern Orthodox Church, and they're the Greek-speaking side. And remember, we talked about that, how in the Eastern side they're going to get more influenced by Greek again. They do not believe that the Pope is in charge of everyone, and they say, we have, apostles who started our churches on our side too, and we don't agree that he is like the head. And so this is going to end up being a separation, and they're going to end up separating. We'll talk about that more next time.